What if I told you that the global debt system, the very thing that governments across the world are struggling to control, was designed to never be repaid? What if I told you that it wasn't just a matter of poor financial management or bad policies, but a system engineered from the very start to keep governments trapped in an endless cycle of borrowing and paying interest? Stay with me. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the reality of how the world's financial systems were built. And it's a story that goes back over 300 years. Imagine this. In 1694, when England was on the brink of financial collapse, a Scottish banker named William Patterson came up with a revolutionary idea. His idea would not only save the British government from disaster, but would shape the entire world economy for centuries to come. But here's the catch. What Patterson created wasn't a solution to the problem. It was the beginning of an even bigger problem, a problem that continues to plague us today. A problem that keeps countries shackled to debt and the elite financial institutions that profited from it all the while. It's a story that's still unfolding today, with powerful families and institutions at the helm, families like the Rothschilds and institutions like the Federal Reserve. These figures have built a system that benefits the few and traps the many. The cycle of debt that started with Patterson hasn't been solved. It's only grown stronger. And as more countries drown in debt, the elite grow richer. Stay with me as we break down how this all works, and as we explore how the system was designed to ensure that it would never end. But before we dive into how the system traps everyone, let's take a trip back to where it all started, to a time when the concept of government debt wasn't even a thing. It all begins with a man named William Patterson and the creation of the Bank of England. This may sound dry, but the impact of what Patterson did changed everything. It's the key to understanding how debt came to define our modern world and how it became a tool for control. Let's go back to 1694. The British government was desperate for funds, on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to sustain its military and infrastructure needs. Enter Patterson, with a proposal to solve this crisis and at the same time create a perpetual cycle that would benefit him and his partners. What he set into motion was more than just a financial arrangement, it was a trap. But it's also a system that would be duplicated by financial elites for centuries to come. The year is 1694. England's financial system was in disarray. War had drained its resources, and there was no money left to pay off the debt. That's when William Patterson, a Scottish banker and entrepreneur, presented his idea for the creation of the Bank of England. At its core, Patterson's proposal was simple. The British government would issue bonds in exchange for a loan from the public, which would be repaid with interest. But Patterson's genius lay not in the loan itself, but in how the loan was structured. For the first time in history, a government had entered into a financial arrangement where the debt wasn't just a temporary means of borrowing money. It was designed to be perpetual. The interest on the debt would continue to accumulate forever. The government would never actually repay the principal amount, only the interest. This would ensure that the debt cycle continued, with each new generation inheriting the responsibility to pay the interest. What Patterson had done was create a financial system that required constant borrowing, ensuring that the debt would continue to grow indefinitely. The government would forever owe money, and the lenders would forever collect interest. This system was not designed to be paid off, it was designed to last forever. But Patterson didn't just create a financial instrument that benefited the British government. He created a system that allowed private bankers to profit immensely from government debt. By setting up a system where the British government would have to pay interest on this debt, Patterson had created a mechanism for bankers to secure a steady stream of income. This was just the beginning. Over the next century, other nations would adopt similar systems. And with it, the financial elites would gain power. But it wasn't just Patterson who understood the power of debt. There were others, more powerful, more influential, who saw how debt could be used as a tool for control. One family, in particular, would become synonymous with the idea of leveraging debt for unimaginable wealth. The Rothschild family, a name you've probably heard before, is closely tied to the creation and perpetuation of the modern global debt system. Their rise to power would mark the next phase of this story. But there's something you need to understand first. The Rothschilds didn't just control money, they controlled debt itself. And they weren't the only ones. The Morgans in America would play a role as well. Let's turn now to how the Rothschilds used debt to build their financial empire and how they shaped the modern financial system in ways you might not even realize. In the early 19th century, a man named Nathan Rothschild was on his way to becoming one of the richest men in Europe. The Rothschild family, originally from Frankfurt, had expanded into banking in several major European cities. But it wasn't until Nathan Rothschild entered the picture that the family's influence truly began to soar. Nathan Rothschild's rise was due to a series of smart, albeit morally questionable, financial moves. In 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, Rothschild manipulated the British government's bond market in a way that would forever cement his family's position as one of the wealthiest and most powerful financial dynasties in Europe. Here's how it went down. Rothschild had inside information that Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo. Using this knowledge, he began buying up British government bonds at a fraction of their value, anticipating that their price would rise once the victory was confirmed. When the news broke that Napoleon had indeed been defeated, the price of British government bonds surged, and Rothschild profited immensely. But it wasn't just about making money off of war. The Rothschilds understood that controlling government debt meant controlling governments themselves. By financing wars, revolutions, and economic recoveries, they were able to ensure that nations would continue to borrow money and thus remain indebted to them. It was a system that allowed them to build wealth through interest payments, which would never end. In essence, what the Rothschilds did was take the debt system created by Patterson and expand it. Instead of just funding one country, they spread the system across Europe and eventually the world. They established a precedent for how debt could be used as a weapon, a tool of leverage. And they weren't alone in this endeavor. Other families and institutions, such as the Morgans in America, would follow suit, using debt to maintain control over national governments and entire economies. By the time we entered the late 1800s, the Rothschilds had cemented their power over European financial markets. However, the story of global debt was far from over. In the United States, another powerful figure was preparing to take center stage. J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, born in 1837, wasn't just a financier, he was a mastermind. He understood that controlling the flow of money meant controlling the flow of power. And like the Rothschilds before him, Morgan recognized that debt was the key to that control. In the early 1900s, America faced a financial crisis, the Panic of 1907. The stock market was crashing, banks were failing, and the U.S. economy seemed on the brink of collapse. It was a moment of vulnerability for the American government, and J.P. Morgan seized this opportunity. He became the savior of the financial system, stepping in to stabilize the economy. But here's the thing, Morgan didn't save the system out of the kindness of his heart. He saved it because he knew that the government would have no choice but to rely on him in the future. Through his intervention during the Panic of 1907, Morgan secured his place as the go-to banker for the U.S. government. But it didn't stop there. Morgan was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. A central bank that would have the power to control the U.S. money supply and issue currency. The Federal Reserve was sold to the public as a means of stabilizing the economy, but in reality, it gave a select group of bankers led by Morgan the ability to control the money supply and, by extension, the nation's debt. Morgan wasn't just a financier, he was a power broker. Through his manipulation of the financial system, he solidified the role of debt as a tool for control. By securing the creation of the Federal Reserve, he ensured that the U.S. government would forever be dependent on banks like his for loans. This created an endless cycle of borrowing, paying interest, and borrowing again. Morgan's influence was so great that at one point he was practically running the U.S. economy. And while the Federal Reserve became the official institution overseeing the money supply, it was Morgan and those like him who controlled the actual flow of capital. This centralization of financial power, however, would come at a cost. It would be a cost paid by the American public, who would become increasingly dependent on debt to fund government activities. And as we'll see, this trend would only continue as the 20th century progressed. But here's where things get even more interesting. By the time the Federal Reserve was established, the debt system was no longer just about individual countries. It had become a global phenomenon. The U.S. government, the largest debtor nation in the world, had now become the center of the debt system. And with it, the stage was set for the creation of an even more sophisticated mechanism of debt control, the International Monetary Fund, IMF. This is where things take a darker turn. The IMF and other global financial institutions would soon be used to perpetuate the cycle of borrowing and debt on a global scale. The 20th century brought rapid changes to the global financial system. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 marked a pivotal shift in how the U.S. economy, and by extension, the global economy, was managed. But it wasn't until the aftermath of World War II that the global debt system truly began to take shape. In 1944, with the world still reeling from the devastation of the war, world leaders met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to establish a new international financial system. This meeting led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions were designed to stabilize global economies and help war-torn countries rebuild. But just like the Federal Reserve, the IMF and the World Bank were not set up as benevolent institutions. They were designed to perpetuate the system of debt. They were tools for the financial elite to maintain control over global economies. The IMF, in particular, played a crucial role in maintaining the global debt system. Countries that needed financial assistance would turn to the IMF for loans, but in exchange, they had to implement strict austerity measures, cutting social programs, raising taxes, and privatizing state assets. These measures often led to economic hardship for ordinary citizens, but they kept countries dependent on the IMF for future loans. The cycle of debt continued, and countries found themselves trapped in a financial prison of their own making. Meanwhile, the U.S. government's debt continued to grow, largely funded by the Federal Reserve's ability to print money and lend it to the government. This money wasn't free, it came with the cost of interest, which the government would need to pay back indefinitely, and as the U.S. borrowed more money, it became more reliant on foreign investors and global financial institutions to keep its debt afloat. This reliance on debt was further exacerbated by the rise of global financial markets. By the late 20th century, countries were borrowing not just from banks and governments, but from international investors, who sought to profit from the interest on sovereign debt. This created a global system of debt that spanned continents, with powerful financial institutions at the center, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The more debt countries took on, the more interest they had to pay, and the more dependent they became on the global financial system. Governments had little choice but to continue borrowing, because if they didn't, their economies would collapse. The question is, who benefits from all this debt? The answer is simple, and it's one of the most shocking realizations you'll ever have about the global financial system. The entire debt system, the system that traps governments, economies, and entire nations, is designed not to be repaid. It's a never-ending cycle of borrowing, paying interest, and borrowing again. And the people who benefit from this system are the financial elites, the bankers, the investors, and the powerful families who have been pulling the strings for centuries. The Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Rockefellers. They understood something that the rest of us are only beginning to realize. That debt isn't just a financial tool, it's a weapon. It's a weapon used to control nations, to control economies, and to maintain power in the hands of a few. And the most terrifying part? This system is infinite. There is no end. There's no plan to pay off the debt. Governments can't escape it. The system is built to ensure that the debt continues to grow and that the bankers continue to profit. This is not a mistake. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system working exactly as it was designed to. So, now that you know the truth, what can we do about it? The first step is to understand the system. Once you see how it works, you can begin to take action. It starts with awareness. We can't change a system we don't understand. And if enough people understand how the global debt system works, we can begin to demand change. We can demand transparency in how money is printed, how debt is issued, and how it is paid back. We can demand that governments stop relying on debt to fund their operations. But it starts with you. It starts with you understanding the truth. And once you understand that truth, you can share it with others. Only by educating ourselves and others can we begin to break free from the debt trap. The system doesn't have to control us forever. But we need to wake up to the truth, and we need to act. What do you think? Do you believe the global debt system is designed to fail, or is it an intentional design to keep us all trapped? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. And if you found this video eye-opening, share it with someone you know who needs to understand this. The more people who are aware, the more power we have to change the system.